recording.
Okay, we'll go ahead and start. Thank you everybody for coming. There's a lot of new faces on here, new to me. My name is Rosemary Walling, and I work with Alan on organizing these seminars. We have a sign-up sheet that we like to do. It's in the chat. So if you could put your name and where you're from in the chat, we would really appreciate that. While you do that, I'll just do a couple of announcements. The next Zoom seminar will be September 27, also Friday. And I think it's at 11 a.m. Pacific time. I didn't check. But it's just bring your own beverage. We'll have a meetup with planetariums, and you can talk about anything that's on your mind. It could be some of your best experiences at some of the conferences. We've had several lately. Some of the regionals may have had a conference. The WAC conference, Western Alliance Conference, is coming up on October, and we won't have a Zoom seminar that month. But if you found something interesting at one of the conferences, that might be something to talk about and share. But anything that comes up is fine. And in November, we'll have a seminar with Dr. Shannon Small and Jessica Trucks on testing options with members of the deaf and hard of hearing community. So today, Alan's organized something really nice and exceptional, and I'm just going to turn it over to him.
Yeah, thanks, Rosemary. This is I didn't realize it when I started organizing this, but it's been 10 years since Alan Friedman passed away, approximately 10 years. And so this is kind of appropriate as a 10-year memorial for him. And the idea of this is that not too much formal presentations happening here. It's just a bunch of us getting together and sharing our memories of him. There are some of us have prepared a few slides just to show, and so we'll see those. And if any of you have things that you want to show, you could share that. And I'll be introducing some of the closest people to Alan Friedman. Actually, first, I want to recognize that Mickey Friedman is here, and she is Alan Friedman's wife. And we're honored to have you here. And we're not gonna sing it, Mickey. But
no, please don't. Please
I
don't.
accidentally, it was not an accident. Actually, it was an accident. It's just a coincidence that it happens to be her birthday. So happy birthday.
The coincidence, yes. Yeah.
And
Alan's sister is here. I don't know if you noticed. Below me is June Entman is Alan's sister.
Oh, hi, June. Welcome.
Yeah, I just I knew she was coming, and there she is. So, and also my friend Sally Articeros is here. Sally was a good friend of Alan's here in New York. There was a group of us that were close friends.
Wonderful, wonderful. So to sort of kick things off here, I wonder, Dennis, would you be interested in sharing a few things to start us off here?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to do that. And you know, I'm delighted so many people online and that I haven't seen in a long time, and for Mickey to be here on her 80th birthday, that's really amazing. And so I appreciate everybody being here to honor Alan Friedman's role he played in the planetarium, but really in the informal science education field in general. And I think I was lucky to be his first full-time hire. We had some part-time people, and I wasn't actually full-time. I worked half-time in the planetarium and half-time developing science materials for the visually impaired. You know, the Lawrence Hall of Science had a lot of different programs. And it was, I'm going to actually share my screen if I can. A lot of these are historical pictures. I'm going to do it this way. It's easier for me to. It's being recorded. There we go. Now everybody can see this. You know, it was an exciting time to be in the planetarium field. It's clear that you had to have an abundance of hair, long sideburns, facial hair. You can barely see my mustache, but that was, you know, certainly in. And this is 1974. And I have to thank Alan, I think, is really one of the photographs that he had. And it was an exciting time. Actually, because there were only two of us that were full time. You know, if you were an employee of the University of California, you had some title like Specialist 9 or, you know, some number. It was like being part of the federal government. So, but you could choose your title. So Alan, of course, was the director of astronomy and physics. I was the assistant director. And unfortunately, we didn't have any staff, but you know, it gave us a lot of credibility to have those two titles. You know, what was really great about being at the Lawrence Hall of Science is, you know, whether you're in public programs or curriculum development, it all focused on a youth-centered approach. Piaget was the developmental psychologist guru at that time. Certainly not talked about as much now. And the inquiring approach of learning was really becoming a focus. And to a large extent, I like to always think about it, the goal was to put the learner in the position of thinking like a scientist. You know, we all came out of the people that worked there, Alan, myself, Alan Gould, you know, we all were scientists. You know, we really came in not from an educator perspective to begin with, but really as scientists. And we went through the didactic approach. I mean, we made it through the university in places where we got talked to a large extent. And so we really embraced with vigor the participatory science education. And Hall, and especially Alan, allowed a great deal of freedom. This was what I think was really nice, to develop participatory approaches in the planetarium. He knew just the right way to mentor, to encourage our development as individuals, and to think deeply about how people learned and what it meant regarding what should be happening in the planetarium. And, you know, of course, the first one, I should go back before I do that one. The first one we did was a Stonehenge show, and I think Alan may have some slides of that, but you predicted where, you had a pointer that you predicted where the sun would set on the planetarium sky. So this whole idea of putting the learner in a position of trying to figure out something just the way a scientist would. And so we turned everything around. Instead of telling people what to do, we had them tell us things. And so if you think about it, the other show that was pretty typical, and we still, I mean, every planetarium I know of that does participatory planetariums does this. Ours is now called Skywatch. In the Pacific Science Center in Seattle, Washington, which is where I spent most of my career. I should have pointed out that I spent 4 years at the Lawrence Hall of Science, but I spent 44 years at the Pacific Science Center. And again, putting the learner in this position where instead of telling them and showing them where the constellations are, we give them a star map. They work together to point out to us where the constellations are in the night sky. So the idea of putting the participant in the position of being a learner. We also had, and you know, as a typical planetarium show, you would go through a tour of the solar system showing Mars, what's on Jupiter. And again, it was turned around so that participants in the planetarium would look at features like this is the Red River on the Earth. And we would then look at other features and ask them to find things that were familiar to things that were on the Earth. So if you go to Mars, here's an old riverbed. So they're telling us the features that they see instead of us just didactically telling them. So that was pretty typical. You know, there's hurricanes on the Earth, there are hurricane-like structures on Jupiter, that sort of thing. Now, I don't want to take up too much time because a lot of people want to say many things, but I want to also comment on, it really became a real personal, wasn't just a relationship, it was a personal relationship. So I was looking through old photographs, and so I found these. This was an excursion on the Marin Peninsula, and you'll see Alan Friedman on the right, Mickey's on the left. I'm sitting there, you know, lots of hair. You'll see me sitting there. I don't know what we're sitting on. And Andy Fracknoy in the back. Well, it was a great.
Oh my gosh.
I knew Mickey would enjoy this for sure. I don't know if Alan would enjoy it, but that's quite a mustache.
It is. Yeah, I was married to Alan before he grew that beard.
And this took me a long time. This is Andy Fracknoy. He too had a lot more facial hair, and we all looked a lot younger, I have to admit. And I want to finish just by saying, you know, when I went to the Pacific Science Center, I went here because Alan and I visited in 1975 because Bonnie Van Dorn, who was then Bonnie de Turk, was the education director, She came down and saw the planetarium, the Lawrence Hall of Science, said, that's what we need at Pacific Science Center. This is the Pacific Science Center in the background. This is me a little bit older, about 5 years ago. And we built a planetarium. I have to admit, when I came up, so this was me about 5 years ago. This was right after I came up in 1977. Still have that large hair and mustache. And if you looked under the tie, there would be an astronomical belt buckle, which I always wore to work. But just to give you a sense of how the planetarium at the Lawrence Hall of Science influenced us, here we have, if you saw the early planetarium at the Lawrence Hall of Science, you would have seen a single row of seats around the outside. This is exactly what we did. And this cove area here was made out of metal, and we had magnetic pointers that we could put on there so that people could predict where the sun would set and do the exact Stonehenge show that was at Pacific Science, that was at the Lawrence Hall of Science. We do the same thing. We still did the Star Watch or Sky Watch with the maps. Number of other participatory things were developed. And here you can get a better sense of it now. We used to have a Spitz planetarium, so it would emerge out of the floor and come up, and, you know, traditional planetarium. Of course, now we have, and I know that Carrie, who's on the Zoom presentation we're doing now, I think this is one of their projectors. We now have, of course, a video projector like everybody else. You know, I could go on, and I think I've probably gone on too long. Alan's role, not just in the planetarium world, as president of Aztec, as president of the New York Hall of Science, etc. So I'll leave it to others to say more regarding the wonderful legacy of Alan Friedman. So thank you for giving me the time. I certainly wish he was still here. It was so wonderful to get together with him whenever we were at meetings. I think about him regularly. Thanks.
So Alan Gould, I'm hoping I can go next.
Yes.
Dennis, thank you so much. And I can tell you that Alan really treasured his associations with so many of you, and it's a real pleasure to see you. The reason I want to go next is because I maybe some of you know the story, but I do have the origin story of the planetarium at the Lawrence Hall. I mean, yeah, at the Lawrence Hall. And I remember it very well. So I thought this would be an appropriate place to tell it. Maybe the only appropriate place to tell it. Alan and I were in Berkeley, as I suppose most of you know. We were in Berkeley for him to study literature at the English department at the University of California. And the reason we were there was because he had been teaching physics at Hiram College in Ohio, but they had such a small physics department that they couldn't support a third person. the third person was Alan. So Alan was going to be cut loose from his job. So he was actually so smart about a lot of things, as we know. He decided to apply to the National Endowment for the Humanities for a fellowship to study English literature, because that was another interest that he had. And in fact, when he went to Georgia Tech, he considered majoring in English. I think somebody with a cooler head prevailed and said that's not such a hot idea, and he majored in physics. So we're in Berkeley, and he's studying for a year, and he got to know people. Now, at this point, I don't know does anybody remember Dr. Robert Karplus?
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
Was he working at the Lawrence Hall, or was he in the science education department? Does anybody know?
He was
at Lawrence.
Curriculum materials for young children. He developed SCIS.
Was he at the Lawrence Hall?
He had an office at the hall. He had an office on campus too, because he was both a physicist as well as a science educator.
Right. Well, he and his wife gave dinner parties from time to time, and Alan got acquainted with him one way or another, and we were invited to these parties, and we went to several. They were very nice, and at one of the parties, and I remember this, Dr. Karplus said, well, and so he was talking about the Lawrence Hall. He said, we bought a planetarium today, or maybe recently. And, it was just a conversational ploy. And everybody said, oh, really? And he said, yeah, we really don't know exactly what we're going to do with it. I remember this sitting here today. So, okay, nothing more was said. Alan was a graduate student in literature. We went home, and that night, Alan sat down and wrote a little document about 3 pages long. I'm guessing it wasn't very long. He wrote it that night, and he presented it to whoever, the Lawrence Hall, the next day. And it was about what they could do with their planetarium. And where he got the ideas, or why, or what. I think partly it was because of his fellowship was going to run out, and where were we going to go? So he gave it to them. And if anybody knows this story, please correct me if I say anything wrong. This is how I remember it. He gave them this little thing that he had said, which I believe must have contained that, guessing where the sun will rise and set, all that was in this document that he came up with out of the blue, as far as I know. And they liked his ideas, so they offered him a half-time job. So we thought, fine, great. And then pretty soon, really, it seemed like a wink of an eye, he was raised to 3/4 time at the Lawrence Hall. And then, of course, as Dennis came in by the time he was full-time. And the planetarium was done with the Stonehenge show about where the sun will rise and set. That's my memory. I also remember when we first went to Stonehenge, which was in 1970, and he got very interested and started reading Stonehenge Decoded. And in the 70s, we took a trip through Scotland and went to a bunch of stone circles, looking where this, and he had this book, I think it was by Aubrey Burrell, who said where what the alignments were and everything. So anyway, that's my party piece for how that planetarium got going.
Oh, thank you, Mickey. That's a that's a special treat to hear the really early days. I don't know. I didn't do a proper introduction for Dennis, actually. He was the assistant director when I started working there, the assistant director of the planetarium at Lawrence Hall of Science. And then, as Dennis said, he went on to Pacific Science Center. But the other person who was a key person when I joined in was Carrie Snyder, who was the I think associate director. Carrie, do you want to jump in and contribute here?
How could you stop me from jumping in? First of all, I just want to do a quick shout out to so many friends, many of whom I haven't seen in decades. And so hi to Edna and Bud and Susan and Ken Miller and Dennis, of course, and Andy, Sheila Grinnell, Dan, Juan, and Barb and Jerry, and of course Mickey. I mean, it's just so great to see you guys. So I want to share my screen. Alan, may I do that?
Yes.
I think I should be able to get this to work. Often I can't, but I think I can today. Yes, there we go. Okay. Okay. So I'm not gonna take a lot of time because I know a lot of you want to add something. This, of course, is where we started. This is where I first met Alan. I spent 28 years working in this place, and I think of it as the center, the root ball, the beginning, because from here were missions to Pacific Science Center, to New York Hall of Science, to Parc de la Villette, to the world. So many different places, things that started here. And it was just a wonderful opportunity. At least half of my 28 years I spent with Alan and learning from Alan. Alan was what I would call, he was a doorman. He opened the doors to people. And sometimes it was a very short suggestion, an idea. He had such amazing, brilliant, and generative ideas. It's hard to, it was more than an idea. So let's, I think I can do, yes, I can do this. So, and these are just a few examples, a very few examples. So one day Alan came back. He had attended a workshop. He went to a conference and attended a workshop by someone who was promoting Estes rocket. He says, Carrie, these are real rockets. They're not toys. They're real rockets. They work like rockets, and but they're safe. And these are so interesting. So we started classes at Lawrence Hall of Science where the kids made them. And it was an opportunity for me to, because you could change the variables on these so easily and do experiments with them, measure their height. So there's a good activity in triangulation. And then planning and testing controlled experiments and so forth. So I ended up actually, with Alan's encouragement and coaching, ended up actually getting a NSF grant to do my dissertation called Experimenting with Model Rockets. And that ended up becoming a teacher guide for many of the teacher workshops that we did. And again, it was based in part on the theories of Piaget, showing that his theories were not entirely correct, but there was a lot of truth to them. And then it ended up becoming part of a series that Alan conceived of called the GEMS, Great Explorations in Math and Science at Lawrence Hall of Science. The way Alan conceived of this whole series and was that it would be take all of the activities that we developed for after-school programs And to have an after-school program, you really have to have something that kids want to do. It's got to be fun, and it's got to be educational, or it wouldn't be at Lawrence Hall of Science. And he said, we've developed all of these. We've been taught them many, many times. And so we've improved them over times. Why not develop a series of teacher guides based on them? So the one on the right, for example, called Oobleck, What Do Scientists Do? I began this activity. It's actually an activity I learned at visiting some friends of ours about this odd substance. It's just cornstarch, water, and some food coloring. There you have the secret. And Alan said, there could be an extension of this about engineering, because you could also engineer a craft to land on an ocean of oobleck. And that really launched me into what was 30, 40 years of my life, which was promoting that engineering become part of K-12 science education, and that people really learn how science and engineering are complementary, how with engineering you could actually get a job, because there are many more jobs for engineers than for scientists, and on and on. The GEMS series eventually got to be something like what Alan envisioned, about 50 teacher guides. And Alan Gould and I got to do a lot of these, and they turned out to be incredibly popular. We got a grant at one time to present workshops on the GEMS series in something like 40 different states. So these projects seeded many, many others. So often you look at curriculum materials now that are from all sorts of different sources, and the basic ideas are rooted in these guides. So the last thing I want to mention is that Alan had worked with Laurie Eason, who was then the director of exhibits, Bud Wentz, and Dennis and I on Star Games and exhibit. And Alan made the point that, evaluation is very important. I don't know where he learned about it, but it was the first I'd ever really learned about what evaluation is all about. And so we did an evaluation of the Star Games exhibit. And this is a picture of a picture of a picture of a couple of kids looking through the telescopes. And the idea was, again, to simulate a night sky indoors and to learn about different aspects of telescopes. For example, how the aperture of the telescope allowed you to see more stars, about spectroscopy, and a few other aspects of telescopes. It was very popular, and we did the evaluation of the exhibit. Fast forward 40, 50 years of museum evaluation I got involved in over the years. Again, to this day, I'm still an advisor for many other groups on evaluation and what evaluation really means and what you can do with it. So again, Alan, when I moved here to Oregon, I didn't have a job. I've had jobs all my life. I thought I'd just get a job, and turned out a lot of people, not a lot of people hire someone who's 60 years old. So Alan again opened another door with the Noyce Foundation, and I got to be a consultant with them for the next dozen years. Time after time after time, he opened doors, and I am just so grateful. And again, it's not just, I'm an example. He's done this for so many other people, so many kids. So I'm going to pass the baton now. I'm going to pass it back to you, Alan. And
before you get rid of your slides, Carrie,
yeah,
Bud Wentz did a lot on the Star Games exhibit. And I wonder if you could go to the next slide. And Bud, I'm wondering if you would make any comments about this. Hold on a second, you're muted. Do you have an unmute button?
Can you
Okay,
hear me?
you're unmuted.
there we go. Okay.
Okay, I was always unmuted. I don't know what happened. Well, I'm glad we got it. Okay. So I came to the Hall of Science when this Star Games exhibit was had been just conceived, and I was the person that did a lot of the engineering of actually how to make all these elements work. And one of the things that speaks well for Alan Friedman is he was always willing to take new directions and listen to other points of view. And when I got there, they had hired somebody from outside the hall to design and build a custom-made telescope that was to be used in this exhibit. And unfortunately, in order to have the image upright, it used the system of prisms where you look in at a 90-degree angle into the telescope. So you're looking one direction, and then the thing you're looking at is off 90 degrees of the other direction. And I said, well, maybe we better try redesigning these telescopes so that people, when they look through the telescope, the direction they're looking into the telescope is the direction where the object is that they're trying to find. And it didn't take any convincing at all. But they'd already invested quite a bit of time and money into having this existing telescope built. But that didn't bother Alan. You know, he was always willing to try a different approach. And then through the evaluation that Kerry talked about, they compared how people reacted to the two versions. And as a result, then they went with the direct view through the telescope at the sky. I was also involved in creating all of the objects in the sky. So you would look at nebula and galaxies and planets and things like that. But when you stood with your naked eye.
Kerry, could you step through a couple of slides, because Bud is talking about the star window.
Oh, yes.
I don't have those, Alan. Maybe you have them.
Oh, Alan,
you don't have them?
You have one.
This is the last. This is this last slide.
Oh, okay, well then stop sharing and I'll share my screen.
All right.
Yeah, Alan, you have one showing the sky.
Yeah, sorry about that. Okay.
Yeah.
I just want to add, while Bud is talking, that Bud developed so many other aspects. For example, how to give instructions for visitors with little cartoons and so forth. To say nothing of all the work you did at New York Hall of Science. So I hope you'll talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'll get to New York Hall of Science. So there's the sky that you're looking at. With the naked eye, you don't see any of those things, just like with the real world. You just see a couple of the brighter stars. But your attention at each of the exhibit posts is called to certain things. So in one case, you'll be looking for double stars. In another case, you might be looking for a certain nebula, and so on. So there are about half a dozen different viewing places with telescopes set up. There was even one set up with hair dryers to create turbulence in the sky or in the air, and then you'd see how it would affect the image. I remember I went to buy a half a dozen hair dryers down at the local pharmacy, and we used purchase orders back then. I gave them the university purchase order, and they handed me 6 hair dryers. By the time I got back to the Lawrence Hall of Science, I guess bells had gone off in the administration department. You know, what is somebody doing with our money buying hair dryers? And so I had to explain that these were really for an exhibit. That was kind of a little fun episode. So go further. Go to the next one. Keep going. You'll come to it. There. So to make it easy for people to read the instructions, I convinced Alan that perhaps the way to go is do a sort of a cartoon format, because people like to read the Sunday funnies. And so all of the instructions were illustrated in this format, very simple, very straightforward, but with cartoon drawings. This particular one is showing what happens when you put a smaller aperture over the front of the telescope and how that affects the amount of light coming through, and therefore you can see fewer stars with a smaller diameter telescope. And that's why we have gigantic telescopes on the tops of mountains to capture the most light. So shall I go ahead and also talk about the Sky Challenger Wheels project? I can just show those directly. This is another project that I worked on with Alan. Can everybody see this now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a set of star finding wheels, and of course there are many star finding wheels that you can buy commercially. What's unique about this set is the wheels can be inserted and removed like this, and each one contains a different set of activities. So, for example, one is a binocular treasure hunt, another is one where you draw your own constellations. The one that I found most interesting on researching was the Native American constellations. What was interesting is that the young Native American people had lost interest in learning about their constellation. So it was very difficult to get the information. Most of it was written in books that was recorded in the early 1900s, where non-native anthropologists went to the different tribal groups and interviewed the elders as to what their constellations were. And the anthropologists, of course, were not astronomers, so they had a hard time knowing exactly where these stars are that the elder people in different tribal groups were talking about. In some writings, they were very specific, and it was obvious, like the Pleiades is known among the people that lived around Yosemite area as the seven wives who ate onions. The husbands weren't so pleased with their bad breath, so they banished them to the sky. And it's pretty easy to know that it's the same constellation that we call the Pleiades, but others were a little more vague. And so I really didn't know for sure which stars were the constellations. I did my best to try to base positions shown on this wheel with the ones the anthropologists wrote about, and I'm still waiting for some member of a tribe to come and say, no, actually, it's this other star, it's not that one. And they never did. So I think the original information is probably lost forever. And then this set of constellations is a very close approximation to what they in earlier times looked at in the sky and told stories about. But that I thought was kind of a fun thing. So later on, I worked for Alan for 7 years at the Hall of Science, and I would say if it weren't for Alan, I would not have stayed so long, because the university is steeped in bureaucracy, which doesn't get along too well with me. And Alan, I think, is what kept me there as long as I was. I have wonderful memories of Alan. I remember one of his student staff referred to him as a boss, and he was so offended because he didn't perceive himself as a boss. And that was Alan. That was Alan. He says, I'm not, oh no, I'm not a boss. He made that very clear. He was somebody to inspire people, an instigator, a coach, all of those things, but certainly not a boss. And that's why so many creative things came out of anything that Alan touched. So then moving forward to the Hall of Science, if you can show maybe that slide, Alan, that I sent you of the microscopes there.
That would be the New York Hall of Science. It's in a different slide set.
You have a way to show
Maybe
that?
we can, well,
It's one I sent. I just emailed it to you separately.
yeah, no, I know it's
if you can get to it. If not, don't worry about it. Yeah.
Well, there's some people here from the New York Hall of Science who would probably have some comments too. So
Yes.
Shall we bring that up now, I guess?
Well, it's up to you. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna have to share my screen again.
Okay.
And find that slide. It should be fairly easy to do. It's not this slide, it's this slide set. You know what,
It's not part of a slide set. It's just one that I separately emailed you.
Yeah, it was yeah, I thought that was going to be part of a slide set. So
no, it's not. It was attached to an email, just the one.
Oh, it is part of a slide set. Let me just jump through to that slide.
Yeah,
that you're talking
whatever
about.
way you get it.
And in fact, this will be my presentation in a nutshell. There's Alan. There's the original planetarium, and Dan Kwan is here, who helped build it. Dan, do you have any comments about that?
Sure. I was at the Lawrence Hall of Science probably. I started in 1969, so a few years before all of you kind of got there. I was a lead exhibit designer at the time, and in 1972, I think it was, Alan approached the department and asked, if we could accomplish designing and constructing this planetarium. And Alan was just so relentlessly enthusiastic about doing this. And so I spent a lot of hours with him. And we talked about all kinds of different things, and not just planetariums, but, just sort of his overall philosophy of um, infusing that kind of enthusiasm to kids. And that really kind of stuck with me and was something that really interested me. So we went about trying to figure out how to get this thing built. We had gotten a small grant from a private donor, William Holt. And and then we had a used projector and a used dome. And we had a spot to build it in, which was a former stage in one of the exhibit halls. And it was formerly a periodic table. So we basically demolished the thing and kept the stage. And then we built the planetarium on top of the stage. It was very interesting because Alan had all these ideas about how he wanted this thing to work. So we kind of meticulously went over all of the different aspects of it. And the most notable thing was that he wanted it to hold at least one whole classroom of kids. We wanted it to be we started with the bench seating idea in a ring, so that we wouldn't have individual seats. And he had to have a low spring line to the dome so that the kids could reach that spring line to put the markers on the spring line. And so it had to be low enough, but it could all kinds of physical problems of access. So we had to work around all of these different things. But Alan was just he's so enthusiastic about it. I didn't want to fail him. So we figured all of this out, and with the help of a professional staff and a whole bunch of student labor, we got this thing built in by the timeline, which was about a year we had. And it was really triumphant to kind of see this come together all at once. And it really was a good lesson for me because it brought together a whole bunch of different diverse people and staff members to figure out how to do this and cooperatively get this done. And that was sort of the launch of a whole bunch of different things because Star Games, which Bud and Carrie just talked about, followed right after that in the next couple of years. And so this whole activity hall was basically Alan's creation. And the lessons that I learned from doing all of these experiments had to do sort of followed me throughout the rest of my career as a designer and as an architect into all of my works. And I was able to work with Dennis at the Pacific Science Center for many, many years after that on a lot of different science projects for kids. And it all was due to this beginning from Alan. So his reach goes beyond just the astronomy and the physics, because it kind of infused itself into my discipline, which was design and architecture. So that I have to thank him for. So that's the story of my dealings with Alan during that time.
Thanks, Dan.
Mhm.
Yeah, Bud, sorry for interjecting.
Oh, no,
that.
not at all. It's okay. Yeah, yeah. No, that was perfect sequencing of things. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to get to your picture.
Yeah, whenever. No big deal.
This was a picture that was from an event at Lawrence Hall of Science that was honoring Alan Friedman. And you can see some of us here in this picture. We were all duded up. And but one thing that I remember very clearly was Alan gave a speech where he spent more time praising other people than he did and crediting institutions of Lawrence Hall of Science rather than touting his own qualities. And he was that kind of person. Dennis already talked about this Stonehenge program. That was the first program that I learned when I started working at Lawrence Hall of Science. And it's a wonderful program. And it became part of a series of programs that was developed with some NSF grant funding in 1979, there was a series of workshops called participatory oriented planetariums, where planetarium directors from around the country came and talked about how to do audience participation programs. And then some more funding came to do that for planetariums for schools in 1989. And this publication is kind of like what I feel is my contribution to Alan Friedman's legacy, is because I've wanted to keep this alive for the planetarium community as examples of audience participation philosophy, the theory. And oh, by the way, this is Bud did illustrations, cartoon-like illustrations for that past series publication. So this is one of them, and this shows the kids hanging the markers on the dome. The one that Dan said had to be a low spring line so that they could reach the markers up there. By the way, I did that activity recently in Berlin. In a large planetarium, a super big planetarium, there's no way you could reach the spring line. And of course, we adapt things. So I had everybody just stand up and go to the place, stand under the place where they thought the sun was going to rise or the sun was going to set. And that worked great. This is the URL, and I'll paste that into the chat, where you can find those things, that are Alan Friedman's legacy, and they're available on the web now. Dennis Schatz also mentioned Constellations Tonight, which is, I guess the thing I would add to that is that Alan Friedman would listen. I came to him after one of my shows and said, we weren't showing the sky, the night sky a lot in Constellation. I think people really have a craving to see constellations in the planetarium. It's an obvious place to see constellations. And I think that triggered him to create this program, which has become an iconic program, as Dennis mentioned, that a lot of planetariums do, where everybody in the audience gets a star map and they learn how to use the star map. It's a very active thing. And when I did this in Berlin, it was, again, a big planetarium. I couldn't hand out star maps, so we projected portions of the star map on the dome. And Bud talked about the Sky Challenger here. That was for an NSF project called Astronomy in the Parks. Is that right, Bud?
Yes.
Yeah.
A lot of these were sold in gift shops at national parks and places like that for many, many years. Yes.
Yeah. And one more thing, probably the latest thing at Lawrence Hall of Science, which is an outcome of which we have to add to Alan Friedman's legacy, is the idea that visitors can come in at off hours, not when there is a planetarium program happening, like a formal show. They'll just come in, and they can control the planetarium. So it's like planetarium as an exhibit, and it's called Planetarium Pilots. And I have the proof that I actually am a planetarium pilot here. So, because I tried it out myself. And this is an interesting picture because it shows the markers hanging on the horizon in the planetarium. It also shows people holding the Sky Challenger that Bud talked about. Dennis mentioned he was an IPS president. That was in 1985 to 1986. And Andy, I want to get to you very soon, but in fact, is it okay if we talk about New York Hall of Science first?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
Well, chronologically, I mean, depends on how you want to do it. But if you want to finish with the planetariums, then I can do the other things after.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and close this off, because this is the picture that Bud sent me. Okay, Bud?
Yeah. So as several of us have mentioned, Alan inspired so many people to go off in interesting careers even after the Hall of Science. And so Alan was my first client for microscopes that I designed for an exhibit at the New York Hall of Science. And based on the one custom-built microscope that I built for their exhibit about Brownian motion, that launched me into a career that spans more than 3 decades now, where I manufacture these microscopes that bear my name and also known as the EZP microscope. And if it wasn't for Alan's mentoring, this never would have happened. I remember he even told me which conferences to go to show these things so that they become known among museum people, and I didn't know anything about that. And you know, it's sort of like he took me by the hand and steered me through the process of how you market a product that's going to be used by museums. And so I owe Alan a debt of gratitude for launching me in this totally new direction. These microscopes now have been there 33 years. The exhibit was damaged in a flood and refurbished, and it's back in operation now using the same ones that were installed 33 years ago. So I'd like to go to the next slide. Can you show the slide? That's the one. Yeah. In Alan's last year's at the New York Hall of Science, you know, this photo shows his continuing interest in astronomy and his inspiring of totally new ways of presenting astronomy. So at the New York Hall of Science, which was left over from the World's Fair, actually, it was the U.S. Pavilion during the World's Fair in 63 or 64. They had these giant rockets outside the building, and they were actually models, but full size, and they were falling into disrepair and almost becoming a hazard. But rather than take them down, Alan inspired, it was a collaborative effort, but what came out of it is utilize these rockets. They refurbished them, so now they're beautiful and safe. And they thematically, what do you put around the rockets outside as a physics and astronomy activity that ties in with the Hall of Science and with the rockets? So they came up with miniature golf that teaches you about interplanetary space travel. So for example, when you shoot the ball to the hole, you can get a hole at 1 if you realize you can slingshot it around the gravitational field of one of the planets that's along the way. Each one of these miniature golf activities, there's something explaining to you how it relates to the science of interplanetary space travel. It's absolutely delightful and obviously very attractive to the visitors. So, you know, that was one of the last projects at the Hall of Science before Alan retired, and it shows his ongoing and continuing expansion of new ways of presenting astronomy. And it was just a wonderful thing to see when I was there. So I feel very blessed to have known Al. I'll conclude by saying
that. On that slide, I noted the two people who are from New York Hall of Science, Sheila Grinnell and Priti.
Priti Gupta.
Yeah. Would you like to say anything at this point?
Oh, I do go. Go ahead,
Can I
Mickey.
also, Seth Dubin is here, and
Yes.
he hired Alan to work at the Hall of Science back in the day, and Sheila for that matter. So I'd like to,
okay, hold on a second. These seminars are not limited to an hour, but we're getting close to the hour, and we can easily go over the hour. But I think Andy Fracknoy would like to go first, and then we can go to New York Hall of Science. Yeah, is that okay?
Sure.
All right, Andy, you want to jump in?
Absolutely, thank you. So let me share my screen. Slideshow from the beginning. So Mickey gave me a wonderful introduction. I'm not part of the planetarium world, but over the years, Alan was my teacher. He was my mentor. He was a colleague. He was a co-author, a cheerleader, and a good friend. And I wanted to trace a little bit some of the other things that happened in the Berkeley years and how I got to know Alan. So as Mickey mentioned, Alan became interested in physics and literature and eventually wrote about a course he taught at Hiram College, in which he blended physics and literature and looked at the effects of physics on 20th century literature. And that got written up by Alan and by others. He discovered some books that were physics-based, including some of these, the Pynchon's Crying of Lot 49, the Alexandria Quartet by Lawrence Durrell, and Robert Coover's Universal Baseball Association. These are about thermodynamics, relativity theory, and quantum mechanics. And so I was amazed when I read about these, and I wrote Alan a professional fan letter while he was still in Ohio, saying, oh my goodness, this is so exciting. I'm trying to do the same thing in astronomy, find connections between science and literature. And he said, well, by the way, we're coming to Berkeley. You're in San Francisco. Let's get together. And that was the beginning of our friendship. Ultimately, we realized that there was a lot we could do together. And this is the first article we wrote together for Mercury Magazine on poetry and astronomy. And we had a good time finding examples of poetry that was very much astronomy based. Based on that, we developed an activity called Picturing an Astronomer. This is mostly Alan's idea, but he let me elaborate on it. On when you're starting an astronomy unit, the first thing before you get too deeply into it is to have kids imagine who an astronomer is. And when you see that they're always thinking, not so much these days, but in those days, of a white middle-aged man in a lab coat, then you can begin to sort of get the notion out of their heads that you have to be a middle-aged white man to do science and that anyone can do science. This was a very powerful activity that Alan came up with. Ultimately, we developed a series of weekend programs, including one where we talked about the science of science fiction and showed movies, science fiction movies, and discussed the science in the movies. And this became quite popular. Here's a brochure for UC Berkeley, but we did it at the California Academy of Sciences and other places. And his work on physics and literature ultimately led Alan to think more about Einstein's work and Einstein's role as a source of inspiration. And from that, we developed a weekend program called Einstein, the Man and His Legacy. And this became one of the most popular things we did. We did it all up and down the state of California in all the University of California extension programs. And Alan did the physics, I did the astronomy, and sometimes hundreds of people would come out for a weekend with Albert Einstein. Alan would even, in a sense, dress up as Einstein or be Einstein in his own inimitable way. And these were really a lot of fun to do and showed Alan's amazing imagination in how to teach. He sought out all examples of Einstein wherever you could find it. Here we're visiting an Einstein sculpture in Los Angeles after our session at UCLA. Ultimately, he wrote this book, Einstein is Myth and Muse, with Carol Donnelly, which Alan is holding up. And after that, we had a fun time always seeking out anything Einstein. Here's a short-lived Einstein's Cafe in San Francisco with the two of us visiting. Ultimately, for all this work, Alan received the Andrew Gemant Award of the American Institute of Physics for looking at the contributions of physics to culture. And I just want to show you some of the people that Alan shares this award with: Freeman Dyson, Phil Morrison, Steven Weinberg, Nobel Prize winner Stephen Hawking, etc. And here's Alan in 2004, well-deserved Andrew Gemant Award. But as someone already said, Alan was extremely generous. And so the minute he won this award, he then was upset that I hadn't won it. And he moved heaven and earth until a few years later, he could nominate me also for the same award. It just shows his remarkable generosity. Alan, I think, was the first physicist to be elected a full member of the Modern Language Association, the professional association in literature. And here we are again at Einstein's Cafe, drinking a toast to that. I want to end with this lovely image of Alan and Mickey and my wife Lola and I in New York. Mickey, if I'm correct, this is Alan's club, right?
Is it the Century? Yes.
Yeah. So Alan got very much involved with New York. You'll hear more about that in a minute. And he was very proud to have an old-fashioned club to take people to. And so I want to end with just a quote from what I wrote for Alan's memorial. He was generous with colleagues, with audiences, with fans, with everyone he came into contact with. Passing on what Alan knew to others who should know it was second nature to him. And I think we can best remember Alan by making passing on our knowledge part of what we do for all the rest of our lives. So thank you very much.
Thanks, thanks, Andy. That's wonderful. I have a I came across something with Einstein as myth and muse. I bought the book actually just recently. I wanted to make sure I was reading it, but I also came across this, which is another Einstein thing that came up. Not to make, I mean, I think it's a political statement, but I was more more interested in the Einstein reference. So anyway, yeah. Okay, let's return to New York Hall of Science. And Sheila, you want to go first? You need to unmute.
Unmute.
Okay. I think we should have Seth go first because he's the original. Seth,
Oh,
are you
okay.
willing to start?
Great.
He was the chairman of the board who got us in.
Shall I pick up?
Yes.
We hear you.
Okay. Alan came to the Hall of Science in, I believe, was 1984. Mickey and Sheila can
Yes.
correct me if I'm wrong on that date. The hall had actually been founded back in 1967. There was a mention before that it was the old New York pavilion. Not quite so. What happened at the World's Fair was New York had its own pavilion. Robert Moses, who chaired the fair, realized as the fair got closer that the fair had very little science and technology. And he persuaded Bob Wagner, who was then the mayor, to have the city put up the money to build a science and technology pavilion. And it's that pavilion that afterwards became the Hall of Science. There's that original building is still the core of the Hall of Science, but there's been a great deal of expansion of the hall, and it's very different today from what it was back then. The hall stumbled along the way. San Francisco, the Exploratorium, of course, had made a grand entry and was a huge success. And science museums were popping up all around the country, and they were doing fine. There was a fraternity of science museums around the country. The New York Hall of Science was rarely in that fraternity. It was a stumbling operation, though there were some significant people involved with it. In the early 1980s, it became apparent that the old building wasn't going to work anymore, and it needed a great deal of renovation and expansion. We closed the hall. I was on the board. We closed the hall and went about getting the hall physically improved, and also went about trying to find a director for the hall who could finally take it into the fraternity of science museums, and also to make it, if we could, a seminal institution. In any event, one suggestion that we had was with Alan, who was then in Paris helping to develop the science museum there. And another suggestion was Sheila. Sheila was then running the Trade Association of Science Museums. And they were we interviewed many candidates, but Sheila and Alan were the cream of the crop. And that posed a problem for us, who we should hire. And Sheila made it easy for us. She came into my office one day, told me she had a problem. She had a little boy, and the hours that would be necessary to be the director of the Hall of Science and mothering a little boy weren't going to work together. So Alan became our choice. What we didn't know at the time, Sheila asked whether it might be possible to be the assistant director. What we didn't know at the time, or at least I didn't, was that Sheila and Alan had created the scenario by which they became the two officers of the hall. In any event, the hall has moved quite brilliantly ever since then. Sheila was with us for the first, 3 years, perhaps. Was it 3?
3.
And then Alan continued for give or take 20 years. And the hall, during their periods of time at the hall, has moved from a stumbling operation to a seminal place. In any event, we now have a program that's named after Alan. It's a program that encourages young people to take on responsible jobs at the hall and move on to science careers of one sort or another.
What are they called?
The short of it is that the Hall of Science existed for the better part of 20 years and got nowhere. And then Alan came along with Sheila's help, and poof, we are an institution of which we are proud.
Well said.
Nice.
What you also didn't know, Seth, at the time was that, when Dan was at 1969 at Lawrence Hall, I started the Exploratorium in 1969.
Yeah.
And over those years, I was in San Francisco, Alan was in Berkeley. We would occasionally cross paths, and over the years, we gradually got to be friends. And we were sort of like sister and brother. I remember seeing a picture of him with his science fair project from high school. And I have the same picture of me with my science fair project from high school. But I should send it to you guys. So when I got a call from him and he was in Paris to say they were thinking about him for the Hall of Science, I said, yeah, me too. We agreed that we would work together. Whoever got the job, the other one would work with that one. I can't imagine doing that with anybody else. And I don't think he would have done it with anybody else either, because we were just not intellectually and historically in the fields of brother and sister, and it worked out beautifully. And I got to work with Alan again much later, and I would like to reserve my time for working with him towards the end when we were consulting together in the last period of his contribution.
Okay, that's generous of you. That's great to contribute. And I feel a little bit bad. We're going, some people will be needing to leave, and that's fine if you leave, but we don't have any time limit on this. And there's so many planetarium people here who have memories, and I think I want to throw the floor open now.
Okay, then let's finish up the end. Let me just take another few minutes and I'll finish up the end. Okay. I retired from the Arizona Science Center, where I went to Arizona to found and build one. I retired, and Alan shortly after retired, and we both began to consult in the field. And I had a project where I needed a physicist, and then he had another thing. And long story short, we wound up working together as a consultant team for a good 8 years or so, Mickey. I think it was 8 years what we worked together. And we had a great time doing what we did at the Hall of Science. We each knew the other's strengths and weaknesses, and we played back and forth, and it was a lot of fun, as well as I think we did some good. And the very last project was we jointly helped the agency in Saudi Arabia create a chain of science centers that would also bridge into formal education. All the people who do technical work in Saudi Arabia are foreigners. The king before this one was progressive, and he's created they have a graduate school in science there now, and they agreed to go to try to move technical knowledge and ability to understand technology into the regular population. So they borrowed a US curriculum, they laid it on the school system, it didn't work. And through a series of links, Alan and I consulted for the firm that was going to help plan what would they produce. It was on and off for years and years, but our last project was we spent 8 days in Saudi Arabia educating the staff who would run the first 4 science centers there. I had 8 women in my room. He had 11 men in his room. I was allowed, by special dispensation, completely covered, to go back and forth between the 2 rooms so we could share the teaching. And we did. We had a wonderful time. We came back. I think we did them some good too. We came back, and Alan got sick. But I finished the project, and Mickey and I have talked about all of that and the help and the other pieces of Alan's legacy ever since. And I'm absolutely delighted that we have become friends. And I realized something else Alan and I had come, and we both like the same woman. That's it.
Great, thank you. The floor is open now for anybody. We have a pretty good turnout here. Does anybody else have memories they'd like to share of Alan Friedman?
I'd actually like to share something with Mickey. Hi, Mickey. I think we've only talked on the phone. I'm Susan Gregory, and I'm at the Lawrence Hall of Science. Alan and I were at the Lawrence Hall of Science all the same time. I'm still at the Lawrence Hall of Science. And one of my earliest memories is being asked to come into a meeting with Alan and Maury Gould and Bob Content, who was the person who hired me, to talk about the planetarium that they were building. And I heard this story about Alan's idea, and I'd never heard the other part about Bob Karplus. So thank you so much for sharing that. That's a really great piece of information. Alan actually was so enthusiastic that day and so inspiring. I actually could imagine myself having a career working in science centers, and it actually launched me on my career. So I wanted to let you know that. I also had the pleasure of working with Alan on a lot of proposals, including the one from the Carnegie Foundation that actually funded those GEMS guides and that whole idea. And it was really a special, wonderful collaboration to support his work and to support the work of the people at the hall that he was working with and all of the innovation that came out of it. So many different things, the Wizards Lab, which none of you mentioned, but that was precursor to many other things that happen in science centers across the country as well. And Alan and I did keep in touch. We talked when he was at Parc de la Villette. We talked when he was at the Exploratorium. Barbando and I, who I think might be on this call, visited him at the New York Hall of Science, and we heard about his ideas for the Stellarium and different things. And we kept an exchange going up about innovation and things for many years. And I have many colleagues that I've known for a long time, but he was really the best at keeping up with people and sharing ideas. And so I wanted you to know how much I feel I owe him. It's lovely to see you.
Thank you. And I'm glad to have your, the sort of next step in that story about him writing the thing about the planetarium, which has always impressed me. I've never forgotten it, obviously, because I thought, wow, he turned that around so fast. And
Yeah.
he just had these ideas, and all of a sudden there was the chance to use them. So I was impressed when he
Well,
did it.
it captivated Bill Holt, who was still alive at that time, and he made the first gift for the Holt Planetarium. And while Bill was still alive, he used to come in a motorhome from Hillsborough. He couldn't drive anymore, and so his friends would bring him in a motorhome, drive him over. They'd go into the planetarium while it was being put together, and afterwards, when it was first up to see the shows, and then they would have lunch that included martinis. This was a long time ago. But Bill Holt continued, the Holt Foundation continues to support us.
Is the Mary Holt
That's
who's
a big
there?
part of it. Pardon
Sorry,
me?
is the Mary Holt who's there now related to the Holt?
No.
No.
I remember later on, when one of the questions, whenever Alan would come to a conference or a meeting or whatever, is what hat would he be wearing? He always had, later on, always wore a hat, and we always speculated, and what tie? He had very special thoughts about, and I can't remember where, somewhere in London, he always went to find ties. What was that, suffrages?
Liberty. We went to Liberty every time we went to London, and he got one tie. I would urge, why not get two, but no. And he would pick the one he wanted. But I mean, he was not a snappy dresser until he grew his beard. He didn't grow his beard till 1976. I remember it very well. And at that point, he started liking how he looked. We had already been married 10 years, but he became a snappy dresser at that point. He bought a Harris tweed jacket, and he looked great in his Harris tweed jacket and his beard. And from then it was Borsalino hats, and he never looked back. He loved clothes after that.
Yeah, he was dashing.
Well, yes, he was. He became so.
Yeah.
Some of the Saudi guys really liked his hats.
Well, he had some great hats.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you guys for organizing this. It's been really wonderful. And for seeing all these people, it's really impressive.
It is amazing. There's let's see. Priti Gupta. I guess she was going to come, but she's not here. Anybody else who would like to comment?
I'll just jump in and say I never got the pleasure of meeting him in person, but I'm a fourth generation mentee, right? So Alan Gould hired Toshi, who hired me in 2005, and I've seen Alan Friedman's name everywhere throughout my career, and now that I'm working with NASA, all the stuff that I'm doing for NASA is still part of Alan Friedman's legacy. So I feel very, very honored to be part of that chain, that unbroken chain of getting people excited about science. So thank you to all of you for sharing your stories. And I'm shocked to hear that Stonehenge was the first show. If you had asked me before, I would have sworn on my life that it was Constellations Tonight. But so it's amazing for me to hear that. And for Dan Kwan, I mean, I still remember that metal bar that was that was in the dome in the Holt Planetarium to hang the markers, and yeah, so it's amazing to see all of you and hear all the stories. So thank you.
If I
Alan, could I, Alan, would it be possible to get a copy of this to put out to the Hall of Science, where people will want to share it as well?
This is being recorded and it's
I
going to
know
be
that.
posted on the web, and I'll send out the link. Actually, the
All right.
link is in the chat, but the link is to our Pacific Planetarium Association YouTube channel, but I'll send the specific recording of this session.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And a special thank you to you, Alan. I mean, you really organized this. You did that presentation in Berlin. You really have highlighted the legacy of Alan Friedman. So thank you.
If
Yeah,
I can jump in for a moment and continue on with sort of the legacy stories. I joined in with Dennis at Pacific Science Center back in the late 70s and was hammered over the head with Piaget and some of the other ideas that made so much sense. And Dennis kept my feet to the fire as I became the first, I guess, planetarium de facto manager at Pacific Science Center, and learned the star mapping, the Stonehenging, and that sort of thing that I continued on through the vast majority of my career as well, including I remember going up to Anchorage, Alaska, trying to give pointers to all the people and say, okay, now put those on the cove where you think the sun will come up on the vernal equinox. And normally that's, a scattering all over the whole side of the dome. But all of these people pasted their pointers right on top of each other. And I couldn't figure out why. Are they just copying the smart guy that came up there first or whatnot? And it turns out no, because in the Anchorage Planetarium, there's a cutout panorama, a silhouette panorama around the dome. And one of those peaks, everybody in Anchorage knows, is where the sun rises on the vernal equinox. It's the only place that I've ever done the show that I was beaten by my audience. The other thing that I've done over and over again is I wound up a few years after Pacific Science Center out in Hawaii, in Honolulu, at the Mission Museum Planetarium. And when I walked in there, I said, well, wait a minute, there's parts of an exhibit over here that came from Polynesian voyaging and Polynesian navigation from Lawrence Hall of Science. Okay, great, great. Yeah, I know some of the people that were there and that did that and so on. Fell in with Nainoa Thompson, the navigator of those voyages and so on. And a few years later, with the help of Alan and others and Dennis, wrote up some grants to the National Science Foundation, I believe.
Humanities.
Humanities, anyway, got grant money to create the Explorers Project that created a hands-on participatory version of that show with measuring the altitude of the North Star and so on, and star compasses and all the rest. Things from that exhibit were packaged into a planetarium show that copied hundreds of slides to 100 freely distributed planetariums around the country and around the world. And there are still a lot of planetariums running those programs. I have encountered them in Denmark, where I was asked to do a show, and likewise in Japan, where that same show is running even today in Nagoya. Anyway, somewhere out there. At any rate, the legacy lives on, and there are hundreds, if not thousands, of planetarians who have had the opportunity to understand what participatory planetarium as birthed at the Holt Planetarium really is all about. And we all owe Alan and all of those early pioneers a real debt of gratitude.
Thanks, Ken. That's That's
I'll just say that one of the things I especially treasured about Alan is that he loved telling stories. He thought that it wasn't a complete presentation and it wasn't a full educational experience until you'd heard the story. The story was so important, human stories, people stories. So I think somewhere Alan is smiling right now, hearing us all tell these stories.
I can't think of a better way to have spent my 80th birthday. So I thank all of you for being here, and it's been wonderful.
I think we're getting close to the sign-off time, although there is no definite sign-off time, like I said. But if anybody else has any last comments, now's the time. I have one last thing I want to say at the very end. Okay, well,
I'll just pipe up for a second, Alan, because I never met Alan Friedman, but Andy Fracknoy got me hooked with Project Astro and doing hands-on stuff, and then I eventually moved into planetariums to do it, and I had this experience helping teach an astronomy class for 7th to 11th graders on the campus of UC Santa Cruz this summer, and I was the TA, so I was bringing in a lot of these activities that I've been doing for many years. And I thought, well, we don't do evaluations with these students. I want to do them and find out what they like. And, somebody just said, all this stuff is common sense. And, we asked the students, what did you like about this class, this 3-week class? And, they said, we like doing things. We don't like sitting in lectures. And so, to a student, that's what they're saying. And so all this theory is responding to the needs and the desires of students. So hats off to Alan. Sorry, I never got to meet him, but yeah, his legacy is living on. So thanks to all of you for sharing this. It's been great.
thanks, Andy. I forgot to say, you need to I invited people to comment, but you do have to unmute in order to comment. Joe, did you have something to say?
Oh, just I got to know Alan probably I think in the early 90s when I was working with NBC TV as a weatherman, and we were installing a weather network. So we needed some weather stations around the area. And one of the first places we thought of was, of course, the New York Hall of Science. I had never met Alan before, but he just, like all of us know, he just takes you in with his arms and says, yes, you got an idea? Let's talk about it. Let's do something about it. And so that ended up being one of our first weather stations in the Greater New York City network for the NBC station. And Alan was always such a welcome voice that it was a real pleasure to know him.
Thanks, Joe. When Jeff Nee was talking, he said there's people who have never met Alan Friedman. And my wife is one of those. And I want to end with something that she said. This was like, she intended this to be around the time of the first memorial for Alan Friedman when he passed away in 2013, 2014. And Diane, my wife, and I were on our way to the memorial, and we got we got to Midway in Chicago, and then there was a huge storm that happened, and we couldn't make it to that memorial, and we were just crushed. We had to just turn around and go back. But she knows about Alan Friedman, and she wrote this which I just want to read as a closing here. This is from my wife. I had the privilege to meet Alan Friedman only a few times, so she did meet him. While Alan Gould, Carrie, Dennis, Andy, and Bud knew Alan Friedman as a mentor, and I might add, so many people knew him. supreme educator and colleague, I saw him as a gentle and generous man. The Japanese word for this is shinsetsu, kindness and goodness. He embodied all of that and more. He provided sage advice and guidance to many. A soul like his is eternal. And I want to thank everybody for coming today. This has been very wonderful.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And happy birthday, Mickey.
Yes.
Yeah, happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Bye, everyone.